tap for them.
Yeah, it's different rules for different people.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, no worries. Good afternoon. Everybody all set? So I'm Deputy Chief Howard Chow, CHOW, and this afternoon I'm going to talk to you about 3 shootings that we had in the Downtown Eastside over the last 15 hours. The first one, and you may have already gotten the details in the email that went out, the first shooting occurred at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon at Hastings and Dunleavy. And this involved a 50-year-old Surrey man that was injured, serious injuries for him. The second one was a couple hours later at Pender and Abbott. The victims in this one were a 28-year-old Langley man and a 25-year-old Surrey man. Again, serious injuries for those two. And the third shooting occurred this morning at 6:30 in the morning at Hastings and Abbott. And this involved a 50-year-old Vancouver man who's also been taken to hospital. So at this stage, we don't have any arrests. We're trying to determine whether the 3 shootings are linked. And I can tell you that some of the things that are going to take place that you're going to see in the Downtown East Side is an increased officer presence. We've also had our gang crime officers that have been moved down in the Downtown East Side, drug unit investigators. We've also talked about our public safety camera that we're looking at deploying in the Downtown East Side as well. This is a camera that is stationary. It sits out there, and what it does is it records information activity that's going on in that specific area. We put it out in high-risk locations where we see that there's a definite need based on public safety concerns, which this is. We've had numerous projects that have been taking place. Last week alone, we had a very significant project that we made an arrest on and involved a very violent offender who's known in the Downtown East Side, has been very active in the Downtown East Side. Been an arrest made on that. I can't give you many more details at this stage. And we've had other projects that have been ongoing, and we'll talk about those in the near future. So this all culminates from a discussion that we had last week. I spoke about it at the police board meeting. But we've been talking about the increased violence that's been taking place in the Downtown East Side. We've seen a higher number of firearms have been taken off the road, about 450 firearms year to date so far. That's been taken off, either seized or recovered off the streets of Vancouver. That's over 1 firearm a day, which is a huge concern for us. As well, over 450 weapons, and these can be in the form of brass knuckles, knives, pepper spray. We've had about 450 weapons have been taken off the road as well. And a huge concern is the fact that a lot of these are coming out of the Downtown East Side. We've discussed this last week also in terms of Oppenheimer Park and the encampment that's going on. So year to date, we've had over 700 calls for service in one city block, which these are astonishing numbers. Anywhere in the city where you're having this many calls for service, where either staff or the residents nearby or those that are in the encampment are calling police for the most serious cases. And we're talking sex assaults, stabbings, shootings, overdoses. So very serious incidents that are taking place in the in Oppenheimer Park. And where the concern is that Oppenheimer Park right now is acting like a magnet. It's drawing the criminal element into the park that was otherwise untapped, didn't exist before. So we're having the criminal element and the drug dealers and the predators that are moving down there because they see a vulnerable population and they see a very lucrative market where they can exploit. So this is something that didn't exist up until the increase in numbers of people down there. And it's at a stage where very similar to a critical mass. And that's why we have a huge concern. And what's occurring in this instance is that it's drawing our police resources over to Oppenheimer and virtually leaving the Downtown East Side unchecked, unpoliced. And that's where the issues are with how Oppenheimer has a direct nexus to the level of violence that's going on in our city right now. So I'm happy to take any questions from you, but I can say that if anybody has any information on the shootings that took place last night or early this morning, if you can call our major crime section at 604-717-2500 or else Crime Stoppers. And happy to take any questions.
The site
second shooting was at a very busy shopping center on a weekend. We had a concert at Rogers Arena. Talk about some of the level of concern given that there are bullets flying, 2 people getting hurt in such a busy, high-traffic area.
Huge concern. There's a significant concern to that area. That's why you're seeing the response that we've been giving the Downtown Eastside and some of the level of violence. But this is something that has warranted the response that we've been giving, is because of the area, very highly populated, the time of day that it took place. Obviously, our investigative team is working very hard to try to figure out who's responsible.
What makes you think that this could possibly be gang-related? Is it because of the gangs preying on the folks at Oppenheimer Park?
Well, it has indications of a gang-related event or shooting. But I can tell you that we've had our crime analysts, our police officers that have worked down there are seeing, and the intelligence that we're getting is that there is a gang conflict that's taking place. And it's that drug turf war that's going on where everybody's vying for that piece of the action. And that's what Oppenheimer's created, is destabilized that park, which never had those issues. So you recall back in 2014, I think it was, where we had another encampment where once again we asked for an injunction simply because that critical mass was reached where the level of crime, level of violence needed to be stopped. And this is, we're supporting the city's decision in terms of an injunction at this stage.
What evidence do you have that it's related to Oppenheimer Park? These shootings didn't happen there.
No.
So what indication is it that it is because of Oppenheimer Park?
No, what I said was that the level of violence is attributed to Oppenheimer Park. So whether these 3 shootings, I haven't said that.
And so why? Like, what evidence do you have to
Sure.
say that it's related to Oppenheimer Park?
Yeah.
I'm struggling to find the evidence.
On the
that points
level
to
of
that.
violence, is that what you're
Yes.
asking? So there's only a number of times historically that we've seen the crime heat maps move. Typically, it's right at Main and Hastings. Over the last couple of decades, if you look at why we resource police officers down in that area more than anywhere else in the city, is based on our crime analysts and based on the metrics and the number of criminal activity that's taken place in that area. So there's only a couple of times where that has moved. One was back in 2014, and where it shifted, that red dot shifted over to Oppenheimer because that's where the crimes were taking place. And this is the second time when it's happened, is because the criminal activity has drawn all the resources over to the park itself.
But could you talk about, like, are you seeing more guns seized, particularly at the park? Are you seeing more shots fired? Like, what evidence do you have that crime has increased at Oppenheimer Park?
Yeah, the 800 and plus or 700 and plus calls for service is a good indicator. So whenever you're seeing that level of crime in the area, where we're seeing legitimate victims, we're seeing people that have been stabbed, people that have been assaulted, the weapons that we're pulling out of there, that's a good indicator to us. We've also got some intelligence in there that obviously I'm not going to get into the detail about, but we know that there's been gang activity. We know that there's been firearms that have been passed around in that park. We know that there's been drug dealers working that park as well.
And as you're saying that the 3 shootings were not at Oppenheimer Park, are you saying that because the officers are no longer in that area as much because you are dispatching them to the park, that's why this could have happened? Like, what is the link between, more calls at Oppenheimer Park and these 3 shootings?
Sure, we should separate those issues, so I'm perfectly clear on this. Is the shootings, I'm not linking to the park itself. Last week, we talked about the level of violence in the Downtown Eastside, and we've attributed that in a large part to what's going on in Oppenheimer Park. So the shootings is just something that occurred within a very short time frame in terms of, and our investigators will tell us more as the days go on, as the investigation progresses. But at this stage, we're not linking them to the park, and that's something that's still being worked on. When I'm talking about the park, I'm talking about what that's doing to our Downtown Eastside in terms of the level of violence and the increase. I know we've got the numbers that we released in a media release last week that showed the dramatic, significant increases in not only calls for service, but level of violence, assaults against police officers in the Downtown Eastside.
Deputy Chief, go ahead.
The gangs that are linked to this, are these long-established gangs that are on the VPD's radar, or are these new gangs that are moving into town from elsewhere?
Both. Some of them are gangs that have been entrenched in the Downtown Eastside for a long time. And you will see any of us that have been around in policing for a long time, you'll know that certain gangs control certain areas of the block when you talk about the downtown east side. And you go one block over, and it's a different gang. And it's a very controlled type atmosphere in terms of the gang turf, as well as the drug turf and how it's broken apart. But now what's happened is you've got a whole new entity being that being Oppenheimer Park, and a whole new number of number of clients that are there that are preyed upon.
Would you call this a new sort of turf war in some senses?
I think it's fair to say.
Some people watching our newscast tonight will say this is a really political issue, and the fact they put you forward on this speaks to that. So we know the city, the police obviously want Oppenheimer to be dealt with in the way that you want it to be dealt with. Is this a kind of a show of force against the park board, you coming out today? And obviously you want to see a court injunction, I'm assuming. What do you want to see done with Oppenheimer?
For myself and myself at this press conference, it's not about the politics of it, it's about public safety. I'm looking at the victims that are out there. I'm looking at the city staff. Field house has been closed for the last number of months. You won't see engineering go in there to clean up the park without police officers going in with them. Of grave concern to me is the fact that I've got senior sergeants that have worked in that area for the last decade that said late at night, they're not going into that park unless their officers are at least 4 of them going in together, which to me, that's astonishing in the city of Vancouver, why we should be afraid to go in any city park as police officers. So those are some of the concerns. Some other concerns are that over the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've had 5 swarmings of police officers in the downtown east side, where our members are moving in to make an arrest and a crowd surges on them. Multiple incidents of bottles being thrown at our officers as they're trying to effect arrests. So that's a huge concern for me. So it's not about politics for me. It's about the fact that we've got public safety issues, huge concerns about officer safety. That is the reason why I'm here.
So obviously you and the city would like to see the park board act, needless to say, on this.
I'd say we support an injunction.
Deputy Chief, there's been talk politically too about a ban on handguns, even as recently as today, with the mayor suggesting that he might be in favor of that. Does the VPD have a position on that?
We've got a position through the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police in terms of handguns. I'd ask you to refer to that, and that's the position we take on it. I just don't want to mix the two issues. I think really what I'm talking about is just the level of violence in the downtown east side right at this stage.
Okay, and just as a follow-up, the guns that you've been seizing, can you give us any indication of what kind of guns those are and the origin of them?
Sure, it's a wide range. You've got some that are straw purchases that I'm sure many of you in the room have heard about, where we have legitimate buyers who own firearms certificates. So they go in and they'll buy a number of firearms and then they'll sell them to others. We've got some that are as a result of houses getting broken into and firearms that weren't secured properly, or maybe they were and they were taken. And as a result of that type of incident, then these firearms are again sold. So we've got a wide range. And the firearms are everything from handguns to long guns that have been seized and recovered.
And Deputy Chief, do we have any kind of suspect description? Do we have one shooter, multiple shooters?
Yeah, I don't know what was released. I'm sorry. I think Aaron could probably fill you in on that afterwards in terms of descriptions. So I don't have that.
We're a couple of days away from payday.
Sure.
Can you speak to whether that's significant in the timing of these shootings?
I don't know if we can draw that conclusion at this early stage. I mean, obviously that'll factor in terms of our resourcing of police officers in the area. Generally during payday, we see a lot more people down there, and we want to make sure everybody is safe. So you will see that sort of a response and enhanced police presence in the downtown east side.
And the images last week that you guys released, there was a number of weapons that were not illegal, baseball bats, etc. And under what circumstances do those get seized from the public?
Yeah, so I don't know specifically which ones you're referring to, but I can tell. Yeah, but I mean it depends on context. So if we're in the middle of an assault or something that we're investigating, and if somebody has a baseball bat on them, that could be a weapon. If you're not in a park or going camping and you've got pepper spray, that might be a concern that it is something that is prohibited. So as well, We've got a lot of, as you saw, some of those weapons, and those weapons in that image were collected over the last 2 to 3 weeks alone in the Downtown Eastside. So significant number of weapons. I speak with some of our more senior officers, and they're saying they're seeing so many people now that are actually arming themselves. Many of them are with homemade weapons. So quite honestly, I think that when we talk about, and I've seen it on social media where we're talking about some of these weapons, they're not weapons and they're not illegal, but just put it around the context of when and where they'd be seized is something that we just ask you to consider, is that oftentimes it's because they're involved in some sort of criminal activity or as a result of some sort of call that we're actually seizing those weapons.
You touched on this earlier, but if you can just elaborate one more time on, we see this across Metro Vancouver where so-called targeted shootings, gang-related shootings actually put the public at risk. And this morning, our news crew was like 20 feet away from where those shots were fired. Can you maybe just elaborate again on the risk to public safety that we're seeing from this violence that's originating apparently in the Downtown Eastside?
Well, sure. Whenever you've got anybody that's shooting indiscriminately into a group or even a targeted individual, it's a huge concern for us. And that's why we're out here, and that's why I'm standing here talking to you about these 3 shootings, all that took place within the last 15 hours. So it is a huge concern. It's something that our investigators are working very hard on to try to find out and locate who these suspects are. And we're asking for the public's help. And if you've got any information, please get a hold of us.
Do you know when that trailer's gonna be out there?
I don't know. Maybe Aaron can pass that along when we find out. So it's obviously when we.
Today?
Yeah, I don't even know that. Sorry. It's very strategic whenever we put those out, just in terms of location, hoping that it captures something that's going to be of value to us.
I'm just wondering, the victims, 28-year-old from Langley, 50-year-old from Surrey, and another 25-year-old from Surrey. So is it safe to say that these people are not residents of the Downtown Eastside?
Yeah, that's the information that we're getting. Is that you were talking about the victims themselves?
Yes.
Okay, yes, the victims themselves are not from Vancouver.
Are they,
They're from Surrey, Langley, and where's the other one?
one's from
Well,
Langley.
2 from Surrey and 1 from Langley. That's
Are
right.
any of them believed to be innocent bystanders, or are they all believed to be targeted?
Don't have that information to release right now, but yeah, sorry, I don't know that.
Can you speak to why they were there?
No, I don't.
Are they cooperating with investigators?
I just want to jump back to your question there, is that investigators may know whether it's targeted or not, but that information I'm not able to release at this stage anyways.
Are they cooperating with the investigation?
Sorry, I don't have that information. And not that I haven't heard that they're not.
Can you give us an idea whether these individuals who were injured are drug users or if they're drug dealers?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have that level of information to give at this point. Okay?
You said more than 400 to date handguns taken?
That's right. I think the numbers we put out on Thursday, but it's 450, more than 450 guns that have been seized or recovered to date.
How would you compare that to last year, or 2 years ago?
Well, last year we had more firearms, but we were involved in a very high-level gang project where we seized 170 firearms. So that skewed the numbers. And I never pulled the numbers from the year prior, but I would suspect that it's going to be lower than what we're seeing this year.
If an injunction was granted at Oppenheimer, how would that actually change things in terms of, I mean, arguably wouldn't that, people would be relocated out of the park,
No, that's a good question.
but would that arguably just make things a bit more scattered?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. So it's, we did this in 2014, and again, we had an injunction in 2008. And what it did is it disrupted the activities there. It cleared out the park. The criminal element went back to wherever they were, and oftentimes they're not even from the Vancouver area. They're not even from the Downtown Eastside. So they're seeing this as a market that has been untapped in the past. And effectively what's happening is, because of the increase in numbers and the number of vulnerable people there, is that it's destabilized that whole area, including the Downtown Eastside. Everybody's vying for that extra lucrative dollar that's sitting in Oppenheimer. Okay.
I have a side question not related once all of this is over, but I don't know if you can speak to this, a question from my colleague at CKMW about the VPD's involvement in a 200-truck convoy going through downtown Vancouver this weekend for a protest. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah,
Organizers
sorry, I
have been
don't.
told they'll be escorted by Vancouver Police.
That just passed or this upcoming weekend?
This week,
Okay.
Wednesday, as part of the VCM.
Yeah, sorry, I don't know. Maybe Aaron can follow that, okay? Sure, okay.
Would you say then, Deputy Chief, that you mentioned prior encampments 2008, 2014, injunctions saw similar scenarios, but you've given us some numbers. Would you say this is worse, same?
I think the level of violence is worse in terms of what we're seeing now. Like, obviously, whenever we're looking at encampments, there's also the health and safety concerns that come into play. And there's the city can talk to you about that aspect, but that itself is a huge concern. But the level of violence that we're seeing, and I suspect the calls for service are higher than what we've seen in 14 and 2008. Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone.